Episode 1 begins with Jake and Emily setting out for a relaxing camping trip at Whitewater State Park. However, the eerie silence of the forest quickly turns unsettling when they discover mysterious barefoot tracks around their campsite and hear strange whispers coming from the woods. As they explore further, they encounter a cryptic park ranger who warns them to leave before nightfall. But their curiosity leads them deeper into the forest, where they find bizarre symbols carved into trees and ancient burial mounds that seem to exude an ominous energy. The tension peaks when the gaunt woman appears near their campsite, her hollow eyes watching them from the shadows. With darkness closing in and the whispers growing louder, Jake and Emily retreat into their RV to take shelter, but the feeling of being hunted only intensifies. We sat around the campfire, its flickering flames casting dancing shadows across the clearing. Emily hadn't said much since we got back. She was hunched over in one of the folding chairs, clutching her camera like a lifeline, her eyes darting toward the tree line every few seconds. I didn't blame her. I felt it too. The sense that something was still out there, watching, waiting. You saw her, right? Emily asked suddenly, breaking the heavy silence. Yeah, I said, my voice low. I saw her. What was she? I don't know, I admitted. But she wasn't normal. Emily let out a shaky breath, her grip tightening on the camera. Do you think she followed us back? I didn't answer right away. I didn't want to scare her more than she already was, but lying felt pointless. Maybe, I said finally. The forest around us seemed darker now, the trees taller and more menacing than they had been before. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that almost sounded like whispers. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush set my nerves on edge. Maybe we should leave tonight, Emily said, her voice trembling. I shook my head. We can't. It's too dark and the roads are rough. We'll have to wait until morning. Emily didn't argue, but her unease was palpable. She leaned closer to the fire, as if its warmth and light could protect us from whatever was out there. The fire had burned low, the glowing embers casting faint red light over the campsite. I added another log, hoping to stave off the encroaching darkness. Emily had retreated into the RV, saying she needed a moment to sort through her photos. I stayed outside, unable to shake the feeling that leaving her alone was a mistake. Then I heard it again, the whispers. They were faint at first, like the sound of distant voices carried on the wind. But as I sat there, frozen, they grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just noise, it was words. I couldn't understand them, but the tone was unmistakable. Mocking, taunting, pulling me toward the tree line. I stood slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I shone it toward the woods. The beam of light illuminated the gnarled trees and uneven ground, but there was nothing there. Still, the whispers persisted, circling the campsite like a predator, stalking its prey. Emily, I called, my voice sharp. A muffled sound came from inside the RV, followed by the click of the door opening. Emily stepped out, her face pale. What is it? Do you hear that? She froze, tilting her head to listen. Her eyes widened. The whispers, they're back. I nodded, my throat dry. They're getting closer. Emily moved to stand beside me, clutching her camera like it could somehow protect her. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, coming from all directions. Then, Just beyond the edge of the firelight, a shadow moved. It was tall and thin, barely distinguishable from the trees around it. But it wasn't a tree, it was something else. "Do you see that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, my flashlight beam locked on the figure. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating. My chest tightened as the whispers turned into low, guttural sounds that I couldn't identify. "We need to go inside," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Emily didn't argue. We backed toward the RV, never taking our eyes off the shadow. When we were inside, I locked the door and drew the curtains, the whispers still echoing in my ears. "Jake," Emily said, her voice shaking. "What if it's not just one of them?" I didn't have an answer. Inside the RV, the air was thick with tension. Emily sat at the small table, flipping through the photos on her camera with shaking hands, while I stood by the window, flashlight in hand, staring out into the dark forest. The curtains were drawn, but that didn't stop me from imagining the shadows pressing up against the glass, their unseen eyes fixed on us. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were muffled now, like they were just outside, circling the RV. Sometimes they faded, barely audible, but then they'd surge back, louder and more insistent. "Anything in the photos?" I asked, breaking the silence. Emily shook her head. "Nothing new. Just the mounds, the carvings, the trees. But every time I look at them, I feel like I missed something. Like there's something there that doesn't want to be seen." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I turned away from the window, setting the flashlight on the table. "Maybe we should just sit tight until morning. Whatever's out there, it can't get in." Emily gave me a weak smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You sound like you're trying to convince yourself." "Maybe I am," I admitted. The RV was quiet except for the faint hum of the small fan above the stove. The contrast between the silence inside and the whispers outside was unnerving. It felt like we were in a bubble, a fragile barrier keeping whatever was out there at bay. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, like someone tapping gently on the side of the RV. My heart stopped as I turned toward the source of the sound. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, motioning for her to stay where she was. Grabbing the flashlight, I moved toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. "Jake, don't!" Emily hissed, her voice sharp with fear. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lock. Then the knock came again, louder this time, followed by a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across metal. My chest tightened as I slowly backed away from the door. Whatever was out there wasn't human. The whispers outside shifted, their tone changing from chaotic murmurs to something more deliberate. It sounded like a voice now, speaking words I couldn't understand, but the cadence was familiar. Then, amidst the incomprehensible noise, I heard it. "Jake." My blood ran cold. It was faint, almost lost in the mix of whispers, but it was unmistakable. Someone had spoken my name. "Emily, did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. She nodded, her face pale. It said your name." We sat frozen, listening as the whispers continued. My name came again, clearer this time, followed by Emily's. The voices outside were calling to us, beckoning us into the darkness. "We're not opening that door," I said firmly, grabbing the heavy flashlight and clutching it like a weapon. Emily nodded, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. What do they want? I don't know, I said, but we're not going to find out. Suddenly, the motion-activated light outside flickered on, illuminating the clearing around the RV. I scrambled to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. My heart nearly stopped. The gaunt woman was standing just beyond the light, her thin, ragged form swaying slightly. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and her dark hair hung like a curtain over her face. Behind her, other shadows began to emerge, their shapes indistinct but undeniably human. "They're here," I whispered, stepping back from the window. Emily looked at me, her face a mask of terror. "What do we do?" "We wait," I said, gripping the flashlight tightly. "We wait, and we don't open the door." The whispers outside grew louder, a deafening cacophony that filled the RV. The voices overlapped, chaotic and maddening, but the one word that stood out over and over was our names. The forest wasn't just alive, it wanted us. The whispers grew louder, pounding against the thin walls of the RV like a storm. They weren't just sounds anymore, they were voices, distinct and deliberate, calling out to us. They knew our names. Each syllable sent a shiver down my spine, as if the forest itself was reaching for us, trying to pull us into its grasp. Emily crouched by the small table, her arms wrapped around her knees. "Jake, they're not going away," she said, her voice trembling. "What if they get in?" "They won't," I said, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. "The doors are locked. We're safe in here." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. The RV felt fragile, like a flimsy barrier between us and whatever was out there. The walls seemed thinner with every passing second, the sound of the whispers vibrating through the air like a physical force. The motion detector light outside flickered again, its glow casting eerie, shifting shadows against the curtains. The shadows weren't random. They were deliberate, moving in ways that didn't make sense, shapes that shouldn't have existed stretching and contorting against the windows. Emily gasped. "Look," she whispered, pointing to the far window. I turned and my stomach dropped. She was closer now, standing just beyond the edge of the light. The gaunt woman's hollow eyes were fixed on the RV, her head tilted at that unnatural angle, as if she were studying us. Her tattered rags fluttered in the faint breeze, but she didn't move. Then she raised a hand. Her fingers were impossibly long and thin, pointing toward the RV. The motion was slow and deliberate, almost as if she were beckoning us. "She wants us to come out," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's not happening," I said firmly, stepping between Emily and the window. Behind the woman, more shadows began to emerge. They were faint at first, blending into the darkness, but as they moved closer, their shapes became clearer. Men, women, children, all of them with the same hollow eyes and twisted postures, their forms blending into the shifting darkness. "What the hell is this?" Emily asked, her voice breaking. "I don't know," I said, my heart pounding. "But we're not opening that door." As if in response, a new sound joined the whispers, a slow, deliberate scratching at the door. The metal groaned under the pressure, the sound sending a chill through me. Emily clamped her hands over her ears, shaking her head. "Make it stop, Jake! Please make it stop!" I moved to the door, pressing my back against it, as if my weight could somehow keep it closed. The scratching continued, relentless, accompanied by the whispers that seemed to grow louder and louder. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps, louder than the scratching, deliberate and commanding. "Jake!" the voice outside called, clear and unmistakable. I froze. It was my voice. "Jake, let me in." My blood turned to ice. "That's not real," I said, more to myself than to Emily. But the voice came again, insistent. "Jake, open the door." Emily's eyes were wide with terror, her breathing shallow. "It's mimicking you," she said. "I know," I replied, my voice shaking. The whispers reached a fever pitch, the words blending into a cacophony of noise that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The motion detector light flickered again, and for a brief moment, the shadows outside vanished. Then they surged forward. The gaunt woman and her followers pressed against the RV, their forms blurring and twisting as they collided with the walls. The entire vehicle shook, the sound of their impact reverberating through the air. Emily screamed, clutching the table for support. "What do we do, Jake?" "Hold on," I said, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, the voices overlapping in a way that made my ears ache. The RV felt like it was being torn apart, the walls groaning under the pressure. And then, as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The whispers fell silent, the shaking ceased, and the forest was still once more. We sat in stunned silence, the only sound our ragged breathing. The motion detector light outside flickered one last time before going dark. "Is it over?" Emily whispered. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. But as I sat there, clutching the flashlight, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. Whatever had come for us that night wasn't gone. It was just waiting. The first light of dawn crept through the curtains of the RV, casting faint golden beams onto the floor. The soft glow should have been comforting, a sign that the worst was over, but it wasn't. The events of the night clung to us like a heavy fog, leaving a residue of fear that refused to fade. I hadn't slept. Neither had Emily. We sat in silence at the small table, the only sound the quiet hum of the RV's fan. Emily's camera sat between us, her fingers drumming against the table as she stared at it, her eyes dark with exhaustion. "I don't want to stay here," she said finally, breaking the silence. "Neither do I," I replied, my voice hoarse. Emily leaned forward, her hands shaking as she picked up her camera. "Before we go, I need to check something." I frowned. "Emily, we need to leave. Whatever's out there isn't going to stop just because it's daytime." "I know," she said, her tone sharp. "But I need to know if I caught anything on the camera." She powered it on, scrolling through the photos she'd taken the day before. At first the images seemed ordinary, pictures of the first burial mounds, the strange carvings and the forest. But then her hand froze, her finger hovering over the screen. "What is it?" I asked, leaning closer. "Look," she whispered, turning the camera toward me. The photo was of the largest burial mound, taken just before the ranger had appeared. At first glance it looked normal, but as I stared I saw it, a faint figure standing at the edge of the frame, half hidden by the trees. It was the gaunt woman. Her form was blurry, her dark hair obscuring most of her face, but her hollow eyes were unmistakable. She was staring directly at the camera. "That's her," Emily said, her voice trembling. "I know," I replied, my stomach twisting. Emily flipped to the next photo, then the next. In each one the gaunt woman appeared, her figure moving closer to the mounds, her posture growing more distorted. "She was there the whole time," Emily said, her voice breaking. She was watching us. We need to leave, I said again, standing up. Right now. But Emily didn't move. She stared at the camera for a long moment, then set it down and grabbed her backpack. What are you doing? Asked, my voice rising. There's a visitor center a few miles from here, she said, slinging the backpack over her shoulder. The ranger, Tom, mentioned it. If we can find someone there, maybe they can tell us what's happening. Or maybe we're just wasting time when we should be getting as far away from this place as possible, I countered. Emily shook her head. No, Jake. We need answers. This isn't just some creepy forest. There's a reason all of this is happening, and I'm not leaving until I know what it is. I wanted to argue, but the determination in her voice stopped me. Fine, I said reluctantly, but if things get weird, we're leaving immediately. Agreed? Agreed, she said, already heading toward the door. The drive to the visitor center was tense. Every crackle of gravel under the tires, every shadow flickering across the road set me on edge. The whispers were gone, but the silence that replaced them was worse. It felt loaded, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to strike. When we pulled into the parking lot, the small building looked deserted. The windows were dark, and the wooden sign out front creaked in the wind. Great, I muttered. No one's here. Emily ignored me, pushing open the door. The inside was dim, the air thick with the scent of old wood and paper. Rows of shelves lined the walls, filled with books, maps, and brochures about the park. Hello? Emily called out, her voice echoing in the empty space. There was no response. Let's grab what we can and go, I said, already scanning the shelves for anything useful. Emily moved to the back of the room where a glass display case held artifacts from the park's history. Arrowheads, pottery shards, and faded photographs of the burial mounds. That ranger said there were stories, she murmured, opening a drawer labeled historical records. Inside was a stack of yellowed papers and a leather-bound journal. She pulled out the journal, its cover cracked with age, and flipped it open. What's that? I asked, stepping closer. Looks like a log, she replied, her brow furrowing as she skimmed the pages. It's written by someone who worked here decades ago. The first few entries were mundane, detailing weather patterns and wildlife sightings. But as Emily turned the pages, the tone shifted. Another disappearance near the business burial mounds. This is the third one this season. No trace of the hiker, just an abandoned backpack near the edge of the clearing. Locals blame the curse, but no one will say what that actually means. I've heard the whispers again. Written 5 years later was even worse. I've heard the whispers again. They started at dusk, just like last time. I know better than to go looking, but the shadows are getting bolder. Last night, I saw her, the woman with the hollow eyes. She was standing near the mounds, staring at me. I don't think she's human. Emily's hands trembled as she turned the pages, her face growing paler with every word. This explains everything, she whispered, but I wasn't so sure. If anything, it made the situation worse. We're not sticking around to read the rest, I said, grabbing her arm. We've got to go, Emily. Now. She hesitated but finally nodded, clutching the journal tightly as we left the visitor center. The whispers might have been silent, but the danger wasn't over. I could feel it, heavy and suffocating, as if the forest itself was watching us leave. The drive back to the campsite was suffocating. Emily sat beside me, clutching the leather journal against her chest like a talisman. Her face was pale, her eyes distant, as if the words she had read were still echoing in her mind. I kept my focus on the road, but every shadow that passed made my hands tighten on the wheel. The forest felt alive now, its stillness heavier, like it knew we had uncovered its secrets and wasn't happy about it. "What did those entries mean?" Emily asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I glanced at her, unsure how to answer. "It means this isn't just some local legend," I said. "Something's wrong with this place, and it's been wrong for a long time." She nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the trees. "But why us? Why now?" I didn't have an answer. When we reached the campsite, the air seemed heavier than before. The clearing felt darker, even though the sun was still high in the sky. It was as if the light couldn't quite penetrate the shadows that clung to the trees. "We're not staying here another night," I said firmly, stepping out of the tote. "We'll pack up and head out before sunset." Emily didn't argue. She followed me in silence as we started gathering our things, stuffing sleeping bags and cooking gear into bags with hurried, clumsy hands. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me freeze, my eyes darting toward the tree line. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked suddenly, her voice tight. I stopped, listening. At first there was nothing, just the sound of our own frantic movements. But then it came, faint whispers, drifting through the trees like a distant chant. "They're back," I said, my stomach sinking. Emily's eyes widened as she looked toward the woods. "They sound closer than before." I nodded, grabbing her arm. "We need to leave. Now." As we hurried to pack, Emily clutched the journal tightly, flipping through its pages with trembling hands. "Wait," she said, stopping suddenly. "What?" I snapped, my nerves frayed. "Listen to this," she said, reading aloud from the journal. "The burial mounds are more than graves. They're markers, boundaries keeping whatever's underneath them sealed away. When people disturb them, walk too close, take photos, carve into the earth, they weaken the seal. The whispers are a warning, but they only last so long. If the mounds are fully disturbed, the land will reclaim what it's owed." Her voice trailed off, the weight of the words settling between us. "What does that mean?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Emily met my eyes, her face pale. "It means whatever we've done, whatever anyone's done, it's letting them out." A shiver ran down my spine. "Then we're leaving. No more waiting." But as I turned toward the RV, the whispers grew louder. They weren't just background noise anymore. They were words, sharp and deliberate, overlapping in a chaotic rhythm that made my head spin. Emily and I froze as the shadows began to shift. They moved along the edges of the clearing, creeping closer with every second. At first they were faint, barely distinguishable from the darkness under the trees. But then they took shape, figures stepping forward, their movements unnatural and jerky, like puppets on tangled strings. "They're here," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The gaunt woman was among them, her hollow eyes locked onto us. Her body swayed as she walked, her limbs too long, too thin, moving in ways that defied logic. Behind her, more figures emerged, men, women, children, all with the same vacant stare and twisted forms. "Get in the RV!" I shouted, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her toward the door. We scrambled inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. The shadows pressed closer, their forms blurring and twisting as they reached the edge of the clearing. Inside the RV, Emily clutched the journal like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. The whispers outside grew louder, more insistent, blending into a deafening roar. The walls of the RV seemed to vibrate with the sound, the thin metal groaning under the pressure. "What do we do, Jake?" Emily asked, her voice barely audible over the noise. I didn't have an answer. My hand shook as I grabbed the flashlight, shining it toward the windows. The beam illuminated the figures outside, their hollow eyes glinting in the dim light. "They're not going to stop," I said, my voice cracking. "They're not going to let us leave." Emily flipped through the journal frantically, her fingers trembling as she scanned the pages. "There has to be something in here. Something about how to stop them." The whispers turned into pounding, fists or claws slamming against the sides of the RV. Entire vehicles shook, the windows rattling as if they might shatter. "Emily, hurry!" I shouted. Her eyes widened as she found something, her voice shaking as she read. "The only way to stop the curse is to restore the seal. The mounds must be left undisturbed, and the land must be acknowledged for what it is, alive." "What does that even mean?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. Emily shook her head. "I don't know, but it's all we've got." We stared at each other, the pounding growing louder, the walls of the RV groaning under the assault. Whatever was outside wasn't going to wait much longer. "We have to go back to the mounds," Emily said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "Are you insane?" I shouted. "It's the only way, Jake," she replied. "If we don't, they'll kill us, or worse." I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stay inside, to wait it out. But deep down, I knew she was right. "Fine," I said, grabbing the flashlight. "But we don't stop moving. Not for anything." Emily nodded, clutching the journal as we prepared to face whatever horrors waited for us in the forest. The forest seemed even darker as we stepped out of the RV, our flashlights cutting narrow beams through the thick shadows. The whispers had subsided, but the silence that replaced them was worse. It wasn't the peaceful stillness of nature. It was an oppressive quiet, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for us to make the first move. Emily clutched the journal against her chest, her knuckles white. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "No," she replied, her tone as unsteady as my own. "But we don't have another choice." She was right. Whatever was out here, whatever we had disturbed, it wasn't going to let us leave until we fixed what we'd broken. We moved toward the trail leading to the burial mounds, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound. The path, which had been clear and straightforward before, now felt foreign. The trees seemed closer, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes that reached out like skeletal fingers. The air was cold, biting, even though it was the middle of summer. We hadn't gone far when Emily froze, her flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated the path ahead. "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding. She pointed, her hands shaking. "There," she whispered. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, just at the edge of the light, the gaunt woman appeared. She stood motionless in the center of the trail, her hollow eyes fixed on us. Her tattered rags hung limp, barely moving in the still air. My chest tightened as her head tilted to one side, the motion sharp and unnatural, like a predator studying its prey. "What do we do?" Emily whispered, her voice cracking. "We keep moving," I said, forcing my feet to move forward even as every instinct screamed at me to run. Don't look at her. Don't stop. We edged past her, keeping our eyes on the trail ahead. My skin prickled as we moved closer, the oppressive weight of her presence pressing down on me like a physical force. I could feel her gaze on me, sharp and unrelenting, but I didn't dare look back. When we finally passed her, the whispers returned. Faint at first, but growing louder with every step. The burial mounds came into view, their shapes barely visible in the dim light. The largest mound seemed to glow faintly, its surface slick with dew that shimmered unnaturally in the beam of my flashlight. "This is it," Emily said, her voice trembling. She flipped open the journal, her fingers trembling as she scanned the pages. "What does it say?" I asked, my eyes darting toward the shifting shadows in the trees. "It says we need to restore the seal," she replied, her voice shaking. "We have to acknowledge the land, whatever that means." A chill ran down my spine. Acknowledge the land? How do we do that? "I don't know," Emily admitted, her voice breaking. "But we have to try." The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, as the shadows closed in around us. We were running out of time. The whispers were relentless, swirling around us like an unseen storm as we stood before the largest mound. The shadows danced at the edge of the clearing, moving closer with each passing second. Emily's hands trembled as she clutched the journal, her eyes scanning the faded handwriting for any hint of what we were supposed to do next. "Emily, hurry," I said, my voice tight. "I'm trying," she snapped, her voice breaking under the pressure. "It just says to acknowledge the land. I don't know what that means." The oppressive weight in the air pressed down harder, making it difficult to breathe. The forest felt alive, the trees leaning inward as if they were watching, waiting. "We need to do something now," I said, my flashlight beam darting toward the shadows. "They're getting closer." Emily flipped through the journal frantically, her voice trembling as she read aloud. "The mounds are sacred. They represent balance. Disturbing them invites chaos. To restore the seal, you must..." She stopped, her face paling. "You must what?" I demanded. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You must offer something." My stomach sank. "Offer what?" She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "It doesn't say. It just says the land requires an offering to restore the balance." The whispers surged, louder and more aggressive, as if they could sense our hesitation. The shadows were almost upon us now, their twisted forms barely visible in the faint light. "We don't have time to think this through," I said. "Whatever it takes, we have to try." Emily nodded, swallowing hard. She knelt before the mound, placing the journal on the ground as she closed her eyes. Emily's voice wavered as she began to speak, her words soft and halting. We acknowledge this land. We respect its power, its history, its spirit. We're sorry for what we've done. Please, restore the seal." The air around us seemed to shift, the oppressive heaviness growing thicker. The whispers faltered for a moment, replaced by an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. "Is it working?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Emily opened her eyes, shaking her head. "I don't know. It doesn't feel." Before she could finish, the shadow surged forward. The gaunt woman stepped into the clearing, her hollow eyes locked onto Emily. Behind her, the other figures followed, their forms twisting and jerking like marionettes. "On frayed strings." "Jake," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. They're coming. I stepped between her and the shadows, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. Stay behind me, I said, though I had no idea how I was supposed to protect her or myself. The shadows closed in, their distorted forms encircling us. The gaunt woman raised her hand, pointing directly at Emily. The whispers returned, louder than ever, a cacophony of voices demanding something we couldn't understand. We need to give them something, Emily said, her voice shaking. The journal said the land requires an offering. Maybe it means... Her voice trailed off as she reached into her backpack, pulling out her camera. She held it tightly for a moment, her hands trembling, before placing it on the ground in front of the mound. This has everything I've taken here, she said, her voice breaking. Every photo of the mounds, the carvings, the forest, it's yours. Just let us go. For a moment, nothing happened. The shadows froze, the whispers faltering again, as if they were considering her words. The air grew colder, and a low guttural sound echoed through the clearing. It wasn't a whisper, it was a growl, deep and primal, reverberating through my chest. Emily, I said, my voice barely audible. The gaunt woman stepped forward, her bony hand reaching for the camera. The gaunt woman's hand hovered over Emily's camera, her long, skeletal fingers trembling as if deciding whether to accept the offering. The growling intensified, vibrating through the clearing like the earth itself was alive. The shadows around her shifted and twisted, their forms blending with the darkness until they were barely distinguishable from the night. Emily clutched my arm, her breath shallow. Is it working? She whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know, I said, my heart pounding. But get ready to run if it's not. The gaunt woman finally lowered her hand, her fingers brushing against the camera. The moment she touched it, the air around us changed. The oppressive weight lifted slightly, and the growling stopped. For a brief second, I allowed myself to hope. Then, with a sudden and violent motion, the woman crushed the camera under her hand. Emily gasped, her eyes wide with shock. No! The shards of glass and plastic scattered across the ground, and the whispers surged again, louder and more chaotic than ever. The gaunt woman lifted her head, her hollow eyes burning with something that looked like rage or hunger. It's not enough, I said, realizing the truth as the shadows pressed closer. The camera wasn't enough. The figures in the shadows stepped closer, their forms becoming more solid. Their movements were unnatural, jerky, like they were being pulled forward by invisible strings. The gaunt woman pointed at Emily again, her gesture sharp and deliberate. She wants me, Emily whispered, her voice breaking. That's what they want. No, I said firmly, stepping in front of her. They're not taking you. Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Jake, the journal said the land demands an offering. If it's me, then stop, I snapped, grabbing her shoulders. We'll find another way. You're not giving yourself to them. Her eyes searched mine, filled with fear and desperation. Then what? What else do we have to give? I didn't have an answer. The shadows were closing in, the gaunt woman now only a few feet away. The growling returned, deeper and more guttural, vibrating through the ground. Desperation clawed at me as I looked around the clearing, searching for anything that could help. My gaze landed on the journal, lying open on the ground where Emily had placed it. The words on the page seemed to blur and shift, as though the book itself was alive. The journal, I said suddenly. What about it? Emily asked, her voice shaking. It's the key. It has to be. It's part of this place. Maybe it's what they want. Emily hesitated, her grip tightening on my arm. But what if it's not enough? We don't have a choice, I said. It's worth a shot. I picked up the journal, holding it out toward the gaunt woman. This is all we have, I said, my voice trembling. Take it. Take it and leave us alone. The whispers faltered again, the shadows freezing in place. The gaunt woman tilted her head, her hollow eyes locking onto the book. Slowly she reached out, her bony fingers brushing against the leather cover. The moment her hand closed around the journal, the ground beneath us trembled. A low rumbling sound echoed through the clearing, and the oppressive weight in the air began to lift. The shadows started to retreat, melting back into the darkness like ink dissolving in water. The gaunt woman's form blurred, her edges dissolving as she clutched the journal to her chest. Her hollow eyes met mine one last time before she faded completely, her figure disappearing into the night. The whispers stopped. The clearing was silent, the forest still. The oppressive weight was gone, replaced by an eerie calm that felt almost unreal. Emily collapsed to her knees, her hands covering her face. "It's over," she whispered, her voice shaking. I knelt beside her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "We're okay," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. The mounds stood as they had before, silent and untouched. But something about them felt different. The air around them was lighter, less foreboding, as if the balance had been restored. "We need to leave," I said softly. Emily nodded, wiping her tears as she stood. Together, we turned away from the mounds, the forest around us eerily quiet as we made our way back to the RV. As we drove away from Whitewater State Park, the events of the past few days replayed in my mind. The gaunt woman, the shadows, the whispers, it all felt like a nightmare. But the journal was gone, and with it, the curse seemed to have lifted. Neither of us spoke much during the drive. The silence between us wasn't heavy with fear anymore, but with exhaustion and relief. We had survived, but the forest would stay with us forever. And as we left the park behind, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see her standing there, watching us leave. She wasn't. But I knew deep down that she was still out there, waiting. The road stretched endlessly before us, the forest fading into the distance as the RV hummed along the quiet highway. The sunlight streaming through the windshield felt alien, almost too bright after the oppressive darkness of the past few days. Emily sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the horizon, her face pale and expressionless. The events at Whitewater State Park hung between us like a storm cloud, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Neither of us had said much since we left the mounds. Every time I tried to speak, my throat tightened, the weight of what we'd been through suffocating me. My mind replayed the gaunt woman's hollow eyes, the way the shadows had moved, the whispers that had called our names. Even now, hours away from the park, I swore I could still hear them in the back of my mind, faint and taunting. Emily finally broke the silence. "Do you think it's really over?" I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. "I don't know," I admitted. "It felt like it was. But I don't know." She turned to me, her expression hard to read. "The journal? It said the land needed balance, right? Taking from it or disturbing it breaks the seal." "Yeah," I said, nodding. "And we gave it back. The journal, the photos, it's all gone." That should have been enough. But what if it wasn't? She asked, her voice trembling. The thought made my stomach churn. I had no way to reassure her, no proof that the nightmare was truly over. All I could do was keep driving, putting as much distance between us and the park as possible. We stopped at a gas station on the outskirts of a small town, desperate for a moment to breathe. The cheerful hum of the overhead speakers playing country music and the bright fluorescent lights of the station felt jarringly normal, like stepping into a different world. Emily stayed in the RV while I went inside to pay. As I stood at the counter, handing over a $20 bill, the clerk, an older man with a weathered face, gave me a long, hard look. "Been camping?" he asked, nodding toward the dirt-streaked RV. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a tight smile. "Whitewater State Park." His expression shifted, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "That's a strange place," he said, his tone casual but wary. What do you mean?" He shrugged, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "Locals say it's cursed. Weird things happen out there. People see things, hear things. You know, the usual ghost stories." "Do people believe that?" I asked, trying to sound indifferent. "More than you'd think," he said, handing me my change. "Best advice I can give you? Don't look back." The words hit me harder than I expected, and I nodded stiffly before heading back to the RV. When I climbed back inside, Emily was staring at her phone, her face pale. "What is it?" I asked. She looked up at me, holding the screen out. It was her photo gallery, but something was wrong. The photos she had taken at the mounds, ones we had deleted before offering the camera, were back. "Jake," she whispered, "they're still here." My blood ran cold as I stared at the images. Each one was clearer than I remembered, the gaunt woman standing just a little closer in every shot. "We need to get rid of this," I said, reaching for the phone. Emily yanked it back, shaking her head. "What if it doesn't work? What if they just come back?" She was right. Whatever had attached itself to us wasn't tied to objects anymore. It was tied to us. The drive away from the gas station was heavy with silence. Emily clutched her phone in her lap, her thumb hovering over the screen as if deleting the photos might somehow undo the terror they represented. My hands were locked on the wheel, the familiar hum of the RV engine doing little to steady my nerves. "I don't understand," Emily said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "We gave them everything. The journal, the photos. Why won't they let us go?" I glanced at her, my jaw tight. "Maybe it's not about what we gave them. Maybe it's about what we've taken." Emily frowned, turning her gaze to the window. "Taken? We didn't steal anything." I hesitated. "Not physically, no. But we disturbed something. Those mounds weren't just old burial sites. They were holding something back. And by being there, by walking over them, taking photos, maybe that was enough." Her face paled, and she leaned back in her seat, staring at her phone again. "So what do we do now? We can't undo what's already happened." I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the further we got from the park, the more the sense of dread seemed to grow, like the shadows were stretching out to follow us, tethered by some invisible thread. The road ahead stretched long and empty, cutting through a dense patch of forest. The sunlight, once harsh and bright, had dimmed, as though the trees were siphoning the light away. Emily's fingers began to scroll through the photos again, each one more haunting than the last. "They're getting clearer," she whispered, holding the phone out to me. I glanced at it, my stomach twisting. She was right. In each image, the gaunt woman's form had sharpened, her hollow eyes glaring straight into the camera as though she was looking at us. Then, out of nowhere, the RV jerked violently to the right. "Jake!" Emily screamed, clutching the dashboard as I fought to regain control. The RV skidded to a halt on the gravel shoulder, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust. My heart raced as I looked around, my hands trembling on the wheel. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice shaky. Emily pointed to the road ahead, her face frozen in terror. "Look." I followed her gaze and my blood turned to ice. Standing in the middle of the road, barely illuminated by the RV's headlights, was the gaunt woman. Her tattered rags fluttered in the faint breeze, and her hollow eyes burned with an intensity that made my skin crawl. She didn't move, she just stood there, her head tilted slightly to one side, as though she were waiting. "What do we do?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. I gripped the wheel tightly, my knuckles white. "We can't stay here," I said. "If we wait, she'll come closer." Emily's hand trembled as she reached for her phone. Maybe if we delete the photos now, it'll work. Maybe that's what she wants." "Do it," I said, my eyes locked on the figure ahead. Emily frantically scrolled through her gallery, her thumb pressing the delete button over and over. "They're gone," she said after a moment, her voice filled with panic. "But she's still there." The gaunt woman didn't move. If anything, she seemed closer now, her form shifting unnaturally in the dim light. "Hold on," I said, shifting the RV into gear. "We're going around her," Emily gasped. "Jake, are you sure?" "No," I admitted, pressing my foot on the accelerator. The RV lurched forward, the engine roaring. As we moved toward the figure, my hands trembled on the wheel as we approached, the gaunt woman's hollow eyes locked on us. But just as we reached her, she vanished, dissolving into the air like smoke. Emily let out a shaky breath as I slowed the RV, her hands gripping the armrests tightly. "She's gone," she said, her voice filled with disbelief. "For now," I muttered, my eyes scanning the rearview mirror. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't over. The gaunt woman wasn't just tied to the photos or the park. She was tied to us. The road stretched on, empty and desolate, as the RV rumbled forward. Emily sat stiffly in her seat, her hands trembling as she gripped her knees. I kept my eyes locked on the road, but my thoughts were spiraling, caught in an endless loop of fear and uncertainty. The gaunt woman was gone, but the air inside the RV felt heavy, suffocating, like she had left a piece of herself behind. "Jake," Emily said softly, breaking the silence. "Yeah?" I replied, my voice tighter than I intended. "What if this never stops?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if no matter how far we go, she's always there?" I didn't have an answer. My mind flashed back to the journal's final warning, about the balance of the land and the consequences of disturbing it. We had given back the journal, destroyed the camera, and tried to make amends, but it wasn't enough. Whatever force governed Whitewater State Park had latched onto us, and it wasn't letting go. "We'll figure it out," I said, though I didn't believe it. "There has to be a way to end this." Emily shook her head, her expression distant. "You saw her, Jake. She's not just a ghost. She's something else." something we can't understand. The tension in the RV was suffocating. The hum of the engine felt louder than usual, vibrating through the air like an unspoken threat. Emily leaned back in her seat, staring at her phone again. Even though she had deleted the photos, her gallery still felt tainted. "I don't think it's about the photos," she said suddenly, her voice low. I glanced at her. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, gripping her phone tightly. "The journal said the land requires balance, that it takes what it's owed. But what if it's not about things? What if it's us?" A chill ran down my spine. "What are you saying?" Emily turned to me, her eyes wide with fear. "We went there. We disturbed the mounds. We brought something back with us. It's not about the photos or the journal. It's about us being the imbalance." Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. "So what do we do?" I asked, my voice cracking. Emily looked out the window, her gaze distant. Maybe we have to go back." The idea hit me like a punch to the gut. The thought of returning to Whitewater State Park, of facing the gaunt woman and the shadows again, made my stomach churn. But deep down, I knew Emily was right. Running wasn't working. The farther we went, the stronger the curse seemed to cling to us. "We can't go back," I said finally, though the words felt hollow. "We barely got out the first time." Emily turned to me, her face set with a quiet determination. "If we don't, this won't end. She'll follow us forever, Jake. We'll never be free." The truth of her words settled over me like a weight. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but no matter how far we drove, we couldn't outrun what we had unleashed. "Fine," I said, gripping the wheel tighter. "We'll go back. But this time, we do it on our terms." Emily nodded, her fear replaced by a fragile resolve. "We have to finish what we started." As if in response to our decision, the RV shuddered violently, the lights flickering. Emily gasped, clutching the armrest as the hum of the engine faltered. "They know," she whispered. I didn't respond, focusing on keeping the RV steady as the vehicle seemed to struggle against an unseen force. The whispers returned, faint but growing, threading through the air like a warning. The gaunt woman wasn't done with us, and now she knew we were coming back. As the whispers faded and the shadows dissolved into the forest, we thought it was over. But was it? The gaunt woman, the eerie footprints, the cursed mounds. What if they're still watching? What if they're just waiting for the right moment? This journey was unlike anything we've ever faced, and we want to hear your thoughts. What do you think the gaunt woman truly is? Could the curse ever really be broken? Drop your theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this chilling tale and want more stories like it, don't forget to hit that like button and share this video with anyone who loves a good scare. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next terrifying chapter. Trust us, you'll want to stick around. This is just the beginning. See you in the next one, if you dare.